There are three basic elements to the lease: what's being conveyed, for how long, and for how much. Here's an interesting quirk about the lease. When is it, what date does it all kick off? It's actually the date on the top of the lease, not the date that it's signed and not the date that it's recorded. So you have to pay attention to that date on top. And again, if we go back to the lessee versus lessor, well, obviously, the lessee wants to get the maximum amount of property conveyed for as little money as possible, for as long as possible, and the lessor tends to see it exactly opposite. So step one is what's being conveyed, and you read the discussion of the various ways that property is described. Texas has not the easiest system, so there are lots of odd sized and shaped tracts in Texas. So you're going to, step one is the legal discussion of the land that's being conveyed. And then you have something called a Mother Hubbard clause, which in theory takes in those little nubs of land on the periphery of that conveyed land that can't be properly described or was inadvertently left out. But also you have not only the horizontal, but also you could actually have vertical definitions of what is being conveyed. So they can convey it down to a certain depth, but no lower, or only below a certain depth. Next is for how long. And like I said, a lessee would like a very long period because that gives them more time to drill and to establish operations. This is called the general thing of how long is the habenim clause. Typically today, what is standard, although it can be deviated, is a 3-year lease, and also it's typically or is a paid up lease, meaning that there's no additional payments required for 3 years. You could see a case where a payment was required for 1 year, and then you'd have the delay rental clause where additional monies were paid for in subsequent years of drilling operations hadn't taken place. But today the norm is that paid up lease where you get for X number of years for this sum of money. So then you wonder, well, what happens when the lease expires? What if I have a highly productive well and then the royalty owner or mineral rights owner tries to jack things up when my 3-year lease expires? No, the way the leases are written, that once oil or gas are being produced in economic quantities, then that lease is held by production. And so this concept of HBP is very important. And frankly, you're going to see cases where oil companies will sometimes drill wells and establish operations just because they're trying to hold their lease. And this becomes a limiting factor for an oil company. They may be sitting on top of some land that they think is very valuable, but they have a cash crunch. They're looking at currently low oil prices and not want to drill, but they may have to because they need to hold the lease. There are other clauses typically involved: shut-in royalty, usually for gas wells, and would be associated with the time when natural gas prices have gone way down. The idea of we're going to voluntarily stop producing from the well. Dry hole, this is where you could extend the lease period beyond that initial primary term. If you've drilled a well, but it's a dry hole, you have X number of days to recommence drilling activity. And then you have the general force majeure, the act of God, it's not my fault. Again, all of these issues have been heavily litigated, and they have all kinds of nuances that for those of you that take the accounting and law class in the spring, you're going to get into the middle of seeing all of these. So I just want you to be familiar with the general terminology and what's being negotiated, because it does get really particular. And then for how much. This is the consideration part of the contract. Typically in Texas, what you'll see is $1 in additional consideration. Why? They don't want the amount of acreage bonus that they were paying on that lease to become known. Once upon a time, oil companies did a nice job of dividing and conquering with land and, I say landowners, mineral rights owners, where they just didn't have a lot of information about what the other deal the other person was getting. Anymore, with the internet and lots of royalty groups, if you will, who share a lot of information, it's really hard for you not to know what your neighbors are making. So you don't have a lot of anymore in this very information-rich times. It's frankly hard for an oil company to pull a fast one on a landowner. So how much is the land worth? Well, it has a lot to do with how likely is it that there's oil and gas beneath the surface. You could go out here, for example, in Wichita, Archer, Clay counties and go to some spots where there might be oil, but there hasn't been any production in decades. And frankly, the acreage bonus that you're going to pay is going to be pretty small, because to the mineral rights owner, hey, it's some money at least, and it's a lark. I don't know if we'll get anything. Now contrast that with, you go out into the Permian Basin, into the resource play areas, and then you're going to pay a very high price for the acreage, because it's well established that there is, for example, if you're on top of a good spot in the shale, well established it's down there, and so you're going to have to pay more, higher entry fee to get the rights. How much more? In some of the land deals that have happened in the past couple of years in the Permian Basin, they've been paying on the order of $20,000 an acre in bonuses. So think about for a second. I'll talk about this a little bit more with horizontal drilling. Right now, oil companies are liking to get contiguous blocks of 2 sections of land. In other words, a 1 mile by 2 mile section of land, which is 1,280 acres. Well, if you're paying $200,000 an acre in land costs alone, you're paying over $2.5 million. And you can see where it takes a lot of money sometimes to front that. So how much the bonus is paid for the acreage, it varies. And typically what it varies on is quality of information to the landowners, but also the perspective of what's underneath. What's the likelihood that there's oil and gas in paying quantities underneath? The second element is the royalty. Once upon a time, the standard royalty was 1/8 or 12.5%. For a lot of the BLM leasing, it's still 1/8, but in the private land, you very seldom see it as low as 1/8. A fifth or even a quarter is becoming very common. I've not heard of anybody that's paid a third, but I've read in some books that some people, the royalty's all the way up to a third. Like I've talked about, the royalty is free of expenses for the most part, but taxes. And just the idea of computing the royalty in itself, there's all sorts of interesting things. And at what point, particularly with gas, the royalty is captured. So there's variation there. Some miscellaneous clauses. This idea of pooling is where multiple people have their tracts put together. We're going to talk about this more with the horizontal wells. Unitization is more on a managing and on a field basis. The Pew clause, for example, would be unused pieces of property. So you may have this large lease with one well. Well, how much of that lease is that one well occupying? And so a lot of times that'll be stated in a Pew clause. Obviously, the mineral rights owner is going to want to make you use as much of that as possible to have it held to include the vertical limits. We visited a well a couple of years ago, and it was a vertical well being drilled out in the Permian Basin. And the reason the company was drilling the vertical well was to preserve their leasing rights. They thought, well, we'll make some money, but it's cheaper than drilling a horizontal well. We don't have the capital right now. The oil prices are pretty high. We just want to kind of prove what's there. And when we visited the well, I said, well, how deep is it going to go? And he said, like 11,000 feet. And I said, why so deep? He goes, we want to preserve our rights all the way down. So these sorts of things do come into play. Once the lease is all negotiated, signed, and then it's in everybody's best interest that the lease be recorded. And keep in mind, again, this lease may have hundreds of people, hundreds of parties that are signatories to this lease, because they all have a teeny weeny bit of a mineral right that you're trying to lease. Let's talk about some of the basics in Texas, and this goes back to the experience with the black giant. So typically now, no drilling within 437 feet of a lease line or a property line. All of these rules are waiverable, and when we talk about the horizontals, you're going to see that there are some waivers for this. And then no drilling within 1,200 feet of another well on the same property. If you take that 437 feet and you double them, you can see that on 2 opposing leases, the wells should be at least 854 feet apart, or 864 feet apart. So there's this idea of we're going to space them out. Again, a lot of this stuff came out in the black giant. And the minimum acreage needed to drill a well is 40 acres. That's served Texas very well. And incidentally, that's not the statewide minimum. It's different zones. And the Railroad Commission in Texas is the one that legislates that, or regulates that, I should say. But these are just kind of the norms that you would expect to see. Well, horizontal wells have really upended a lot of that, and you can see why. right now in the Permian Basin, they're drilling laterals that are up to 2 miles long. So the horizontal part of the well is 2 miles long. And that's why you're starting to see increasingly companies leasing 2 sections of land, 2 1-mile squares of land, so that they can get on the very edge of one, drill down, and run the lateral all the way across. So this is where sometimes you'll see where they come closer than 437 feet to the edge of the property. Then you get into some interesting questions when you're doing these long laterals. What if somebody, a mineral rights owner in the middle of this long lateral, doesn't want to sign up? Well, that's a problem. Now in Oklahoma, they have forced pooling where they can say, we hear you, you're outvoted, you'll get your check, so long as an X number of percentage of the other mineral rights owners want to participate. And then you get the payments. How do you figure out what share of the royalty belongs to which of the mineral rights owners when you have this long lateral shooting through a lot of people's property? Then you have this whole idea of spacing. What they're trying to figure out is how far apart do we have to drill these horizontal wells? And they're looking at numbers that may be as little as 600 and 800 feet apart. Also, they may drill in the same hole and just come out in the Permian Basin and go out at a different vertical depth. So the real picture that I want you to get is leasing, which had been fairly stable for a while, has been fairly upended by this whole idea of horizontal wells. So we've tapped into, now that the geologist says drill here, enter the landman to take care of that situation. And how they take care of that in its most basic form is the oil and gas lease. You're going to find in a lot of companies, particularly the smaller oil and gas companies, landmen are increasingly seen as the more savvy business people and are engaged in a lot more financial modeling as to the economic viability of the wells and those sorts of things. So landmen are, particularly in the small independents, are not just about land. They're another business leader who has a specialty in land but is expected to be fluent in a lot of other topics. So now that we've secured the land, the next major topic, or I should say secured the rights to drill, to try to mine the minerals, what we're now going to turn our attention to in the course is drilling the well.